Her father sold her like cattle, a transaction sealed not with a handshake, but with a shuddering breath that stole the air from Ilara's lung. $60, the old man had haggled, as if her worth were no more than a meager sum, a final indignity in a lifetime of quiet suffering. She arrived on the isolated ranch on a Tuesday, dust clinging to her worn dress, the last light of a brutal summer day staining the horizon. Elias Thorne met her at the porch, his silhouette a hulking shadow against the setting sun. His gaze, even from a distance, was a heavy weight. He hadn't expected her. He'd expected her mother, a woman promised in a letter that spoke of practicality and shared burdens, not a girl barely past 18, her eyes wide with a desperate, familiar fear. The horse beneath her shifted, restless, mirroring the turmoil in her gut. He just stared, his jaw tight, the silence stretching between them, thick and cold as a winter river. This was the moment her world fractured anew, the promise of a life slipping through her fingers like sand. She felt the shame of it settled deep in her bones, a cold, heavy burden. This was the raw truth of being unwanted, not even a suitable replacement, simply a burden misplaced. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The words, when Elias finally spoke them, were not a welcome, but a flat accusation. You're not Amelia. His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding. Ilara dismounted, her legs weak, the dust rising around her boots. No, sir, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. My mother, she passed. A fever, sudden. The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but the truth of her father's gambling debts and the cold, calculated decision to send his youngest daughter in place of the promised bride, was too ugly for light. He looked at her then, truly looked, and she felt naked under his scrutiny. He saw the tremble in her hands, the bruised vulnerability in her eyes. He saw the ghost of every hard day, every empty plate, every unkind word etched into her too young face. The rancher was a hard man, known for his solitude and his stubborn will. He stood there, legs braced, his anger a palpable thing. She sent you? He asked. A question that wasn't a question, but a stark disbelief. Ilara could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. She was an orphan now, by decree and by circumstance. The world was a vast, unforgiving place, and she, a speck of dust carried by a merciless wind. Her only hope was this reluctant rancher, this stranger who had no reason to offer kindness, only judgment. She knew she was a disappointment, a broken promise. Elias turned away, his broad shoulders a wall. The rejection was clear, unspoken, yet as sharp as any knife. He paced a few steps, then stopped, running a calloused hand through his dark hair. Ilara watched him, her heart thrumming against her ribs. This wasn't about the woman he'd been promised. It was about the broken trust, the deceit. But for Ilara, it was about survival. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Her father had made sure of that, severing all ties, leaving her adrift. Please, sir, she ventured, her voice thin, fragile. I can work. I'm strong. I ain't afraid of hard labor. The desperation in her plea hung heavy in the twilight air. He stopped pacing, turning back to her, his gaze shadowed. He saw the truth in her eyes now, the raw, undeniable need. It was a look he knew well, a reflection of his own solitary journey. The ranch needed a woman's touch, a steady hand with the chores, a presence in the quiet house. But not this way, not a girl sold as a substitute. The dilemma was clear: send her back to an unknown fate, or take on a burden he hadn't asked for. The wind stirred the dust again, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant pines. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the land. There's a cot in the bunkhouse, he finally said, his tone devoid of warmth, but not entirely of a grudging acceptance. You'll earn your keep. It wasn't a welcome, but it wasn't outright rejection either. It was a lifeline, tenuous and uncertain, but a lifeline nonetheless. Ilara swallowed, a wave of relief washing over her, cold and dizzying. She had a place, for now. The first few weeks on Elias's ranch were a blur of aching muscles and quiet vigilance. Ilara rose before the sun, her hands quickly learning the rhythm of the ranch. She cleaned, she cooked, she tended to the small garden. Her movements were swift, efficient, born of necessity, and a deep-seated fear of proving herself unworthy. Elias, for his part, remained a distant figure. He observed her, his eyes often following her from the periphery of his vision, but he spoke little. His silence was not unkind, but it was watchful, assessing. She felt like a stray dog, allowed on the porch but not yet invited inside. Yet, in those small, silent exchanges, a fragile trust began to form. He never raised his voice, never looked at her with the disgust she had come to expect. One evening, after a particularly long day of mending fences, she brought him his supper, a simple stew. He grunted his thanks, but as she turned to leave, he said, "Your mother, was she truly ill?" The question was soft, unexpected. Alara hesitated, her heart hammering. The truth was a sharp stone in her pocket. "She was," Ilara said, her voice strained. "She was very ill." It was a partial truth, a way to deflect without fully lying. He nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. The lie, or omission, felt less like deceit and more like a necessary shield. The air between them, though still guarded, seemed to soften just a fraction. Elias had a niece, a quiet wisp of a girl named Clara, who lived with him. Her parents had been taken by the same fever that had claimed Elara's mother. Clara was barely 5, her eyes too large for her thin face, haunted by a grief Elara understood intimately. Clara rarely spoke, clinging to the worn fabric of Elias's pant leg whenever strangers approached. Elara saw her own younger self in Clara, the same quiet desperation, the burden of a world that offered little comfort. One afternoon, Elara found Clara sitting by the creek, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. Elara sat beside her, offering a piece of dried apple. Clara took it, her small fingers brushing Elara's. It was the first physical contact that wasn't a chore. "Do you miss your mama?" Elara asked softly. Clara nodded, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Every day," Elara whispered, her own pain echoing Clara's. It was a simple moment, but in it, a profound connection forged. Elara found solace in Clara's quiet presence, a mirror of her own solitude now slowly being filled. She read to Clara from an old tattered book Elias kept on his shelf, her voice a soothing balm. Elias watched them from the porch, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name in his own eyes. Perhaps it was the sight of a fragile bond forming, a tentative sense of belonging taking root in the harsh, isolated land. The ranch, once merely a place of grim survival, began to hum with a new, quiet life. The delicate peace was shattered by the arrival of Mr. Abernathy, a banker from the nearest town. He came with a grim face and a sheaf of papers, demanding payment on a debt Elara's father had incurred, a debt now legally transferred to Elara as the last living relative. Abernathy's eyes gleamed with an unpleasant satisfaction. He had known her father, had known the family's precarious existence. The girl was supposed to be a bride, he sneered, his gaze sweeping over Elara with thinly veiled disdain. Now she's just a liability. He spoke of public shaming, of the law, of taking what was owed. Elara felt the old familiar dread coil in her stomach. Desperation, that cold companion, returned. She was weak in the eyes of the law, easy prey. Elias stepped forward, his presence a solid, unyielding wall between Elara and the banker. "The debt is not hers," he stated, his voice low, dangerous. "And she is under my protection," Abernathy scoffed, his face twisting into a smirk. "Protection? Or ownership, Mr. Thorne? The whole town knows you took her in, because her mother didn't show. A discarded girl, a convenient hand." The words stung, a public accusation of what Elara had always feared, that she was merely a thing, a transaction, a stand-in. The fear of community judgment, of being exposed, burned hot in her cheeks. Elias's jaw tightened. This was more than money. It was about honor, about the fragile safety he had inadvertently offered. Abernathy's threats hung in the air like a storm cloud. He promised to return with the sheriff, to expose the arrangement, to publicly shame Elara, and, by extension, Elias. The very air around the ranch grew taut with tension. Elara moved through her days with a renewed sense of urgency, every chore a prayer against the looming threat. She overheard the ranch hands whispering, their rough voices laced with pity and speculation. Elias, usually so stoic, carried a weight in his shoulders she hadn't seen before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Elias found Alara sitting alone by the creek, tears silent on her face. "He'll take everything," she whispered, her voice raw. "He'll say I'm no better than my father, that I lied. He'll take Clara." The thought of Clara, innocent and vulnerable, suffering because of her, was unbearable. Elias sat beside her, closer than he ever had before. "He won't," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I won't let him." He reached out, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder. The warmth of his touch was surprising, a silent affirmation. "Tell me," he said, his voice barely audible. "Tell me the truth about your mother." The dam burst. Ilara, through sobs, recounted the long, agonizing story of her father's decline, his gambling, his cruelty, the chilling decision to send her, a child, in her mother's stead, leaving her mother to die alone. Elias listened, his face grim, his touch a steady anchor. He understood now. It wasn't about a debt, it was about a desperate, frightened girl abandoned to the wolves. The next morning, Elias rode into town, a grim determination set on his face. Alara watched him go, a knot of fear and a strange, burgeoning hope twisting in her stomach. He was choosing to fight for her, a choice she hadn't known she possessed, the right to inspire. He returned late that night, tired but resolute. The sheriff had been difficult, swayed by Abernathy's influence and the town's whispers, but Elias, in his quiet, unyielding way, had countered every accusation. He had produced old ledgers, meticulously kept, showing how his own family had been cheated by Abernathy's father years ago, a debt long forgotten but never truly gone. He'd made a deal, a sacrifice. He wouldn't press the old claim, but in return, Abernathy would drop his suit against Alara and her father's debt. The banker, faced with his own family's skeletons, had grudgingly agreed. Elias had not paid a dime of her father's debt, but he had leveraged history, protecting Alara without buying her freedom, but earning it instead. He had not triumphed heroically, but quietly, with a strength of character that resonated deeper than any shout. The danger was gone. For now. Ilara looked at him, her heart overflowing with a gratitude that transcended words. He had seen her burden, and he had shouldered it with her. She was not broken. She was, for the first time, truly safe. The weeks that followed brought a fragile peace to the ranch. The specter of Abernathy lingered in the collective memory of the town, but his hold on their lives had been broken. Elias, through his quiet sacrifice, had cemented his place in Elara's heart, not as a master, but as a protector, a partner in the challenging life they shared. Clara, sensing the shift, bloomed. She laughed more freely, her small hand often finding Alara's, a silent declaration of found family. Alara, too, found a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. The shame that had haunted her for so long began to recede, replaced by a burgeoning sense of worth. She had been chosen, not out of obligation, but out of a steadfast kindness. Elias was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He began to share the ranch's stories with her, the history of the land, the challenges he'd faced alone. And Ilara, in turn, began to speak of her own past, the gentle memories before the darkness, the hopes she had once dared to dream. The ranch, once a place of solitude, became a home, a sanctuary. The scars of their pasts remained, etched into their very beings, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were the marks of survival, testaments to resilience. One blustery autumn evening, as the first cold breath of winter touched the high plains, Ilara stood with Elias on the porch. Clara was asleep inside, nestled warm by the hearth. The wind whipped at their clothes, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. "This is a good life," Ilara said, her voice soft, surprising even herself with the truth of the words. Elias nodded, his gaze distant yet content. "It is," he affirmed, his voice gruff, but with an underlying tenderness. She looked at him, truly saw him, the lines of weariness around his eyes, the strength in his hands, the quiet integrity that defined him. He was not a savior, but a companion. She was not a possession, but a woman who had chosen to stay, who had chosen to belong. They had found healing, not in grand gestures, but in the steady rhythm of shared days, in quiet acts of kindness, in the unwavering trust that had blossomed between them. The landscape around them was harsh, unforgiving, but within the walls of their home, a quiet warmth had taken root. The promise of winter was in the air, but they would face it together, their bond forged in hardship, strengthened by choice, and affirmed by a love as enduring as the ancient trees that dotted the distant ridges. The journey was not over, but the path ahead, though uncertain, was no longer walked alone.